It is March 1907, and a Hungarian-born archaeologist named Aurel Stein is digging through the ruins of a watchtower on the edge of the Gobi Desert. The tower is mud brick. It has been collapsing for 16 centuries. Around it, there is nothing but gravel and wind, and the flat white glare of the desert west of Dunhuang. He is looking for documents. He finds a bag. Inside it are letters, folded paper tied with string, addressed in a language nobody in the region has spoken for more than 1,000 years. They were written in Sogdian by Sogdian merchants somewhere around the year 313. They were placed in the post, they were carried out into the desert, and they never arrived. Most of them are business, debts, silver, partners who went east and did not return. The ordinary bookkeeping of people making a living a very long way from home. But one of them is not business. It is written by a woman named Mine. She had followed her husband, a merchant named Nanai Dat, 2,000 miles east to Dunhuang. And then he had gone. No word, no letters, no money. She writes to her mother first. She has asked every man she is required to ask for permission to travel home, and every one of them has told her to wait. She has no clothes. She has no money. She is living on what the local priest is willing to give her. Then she writes to her husband. That letter is shorter, and it is angry, and it ends with a line so bitter that scholars still hesitate over how to translate it politely. She tells him she would rather have married an animal. Neither letter reached anyone. They sat in a ruined tower in the sand for 1,600 years until a man with a shovel opened the bag. Mine's letters are the oldest surviving documents written in the Sogdian language. And the reason that matters is not archaeological. It is that Sogdian is not entirely dead. There is one valley left on Earth where the language of those merchants is still spoken by the people who live in it, in houses without a road running to them at 3,000 meters above sea level. That valley is in Tajikistan. And the country it sits in has spent the last 30 years doing exactly what Mine's husband did, sending its people out, waiting for the money to come back. This is Tajikistan, 93% mountain, the third highest country on Earth by average elevation, behind only Bhutan and Nepal. A place of roughly 10.5 million people, wedged between Afghanistan, China, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan, with no coastline, no oil, and almost no flat ground. And in 2024, workers outside its borders sent home $5.8 billion. That figure is not a subsidy, it is not aid, it is wages, earned somewhere else, moved across a border in small amounts by ordinary people. Depending on which institution is doing the counting, it represented somewhere between 45 and 49% of everything the country's economy produced that year. Not a share of foreign income, a share of the whole economy. It is the highest ratio in the world. Second place is Tonga at 38%. Nowhere else is close. Which means that when you look at Tajikistan, you are not looking at a country that is failing to support itself. You are looking at a country whose largest and most reliable export has never been cotton or aluminum, or electricity. It has always been people. What that arrangement builds, what it costs, and who pays for it, is the whole story of this place. It begins in a city that only exists because of a Monday, Dushanbe. The name means Monday because for centuries this was nothing more than a village that hosted a weekly market on that day. In 1925, it was a settlement of a few thousand people. Today, it holds more than 1 million. Walk it now, and the first thing you notice is the newness. Wide boulevards, white marble facades, a flagpole outside the presidential palace that was, for several years, the tallest in the world at 165 meters. A statue of Ismail Somoni, the 10th century emir, whose name is on the currency, on the highest mountain in the country, and on this square. The second thing you notice takes longer. It is in the wedding halls. Tajik weddings are enormous, hundreds of guests, days of feasting. The government has actually passed laws limiting how much a family is allowed to spend on one, because families were bankrupting themselves to hold them. And the money in those halls, in most cases, was not earned in that hall's city. It was earned on a construction site in Moscow, or in a warehouse outside St. Petersburg, or sweeping a street in Novosibirsk, and sent home in installments over 3 or 4 years. Look closely at the photographs from those weddings, and something is missing from a great many of them. The men of working age, the brother in Yekaterinburg who could not get leave, the father who has not been home in 2 years, the groom's uncles, all 4 of them, in a city 2,000 miles north. The country is full, the photographs are not. Beyond the capital, the ground rises fast. Within an hour of Dushanbe, the road is climbing, and it does not stop climbing for the rest of the country. 93% of Tajikistan is mountain. The Pamirs in the east, the Fan and the Hisar ranges in the center, the Tian Shan foothills to the north. Fedchenko Glacier, 77 kilometers of ice, the longest glacier in the world outside the polar regions, and the high Himalaya. Passes above 4,600 meters that close with the first snow and stay closed for half the year. And in the highest and emptiest part of it lives an animal that most people have never seen, and that Tajikistan has more of than anywhere else on the planet: the Marco Polo sheep. It is a subspecies of argali, and it is enormous. A mature ram carries spiraled horns that can exceed 1.5 meters, and in exceptional animals approach 1.9 meters, measured along the curve. That is more horn than any other wild sheep on earth carries. It is named for the 13th century merchant who described them in his account of crossing the Pamir, because for 600 years afterward, Europeans assumed he had exaggerated. He had not. They live above 4,000 meters, where the air holds roughly 60% of the oxygen available at sea level. They do not shelter. There is nothing to shelter in. They handle winter by moving, grazing a plant layer so thin that a herd has to keep walking simply to eat enough. Eastern Tajikistan holds at least 24,000 of them, more than any other country, and the reason is uncomfortable. They survived because they became valuable. Foreign hunters pay tens of thousands of dollars for a permit, and the money runs through community conservancies that employ local rangers, fund village water systems, and make a living ram worth more to a herder than a poached one.
It is not a clean story.
But the sheep are still there, and the men watching them through spotting scopes on the ridgelines above Alachur are Tajik and Kyrgyz herders who used to hunt them. To understand why this country sends its people away, you have to go west to the Zarafshan Valley and go back about 1400 years. There is a ruined city on a hill outside the modern town of Panjakent. Mud walls, worn to the shape of the ground. A citadel, a bazaar, 2 temples, and the outlines of about 130 houses. It was a Sogdian city, and the Sogdians were, for roughly 6 centuries, the most effective commercial people in Asia. They were not conquerors, they had no empire. What they had was a network. Sogdian merchants ran the trade of the Silk Road from Byzantium to the Chinese capital, and they did it by planting permanent colonies of their own people in other people's cities. A trader in Chang'an could get credit from a Sogdian in Dunhuang, guaranteed by a family in Samarkand, against goods that had not left India yet. Their language became the working tongue of the road, not because they ruled anything, because everybody had to deal with them. And the shape of that life is the shape of this country's life now. The earners went out. The families stayed home. The money traveled back along a chain of trust that ran for thousands of kilometers. Its walls were covered in paintings, not religious scenes for the most part, feasts, musicians, board games, heroes from the Persian epics, including a version of the Rostam story, painted 3 centuries before anyone wrote it down in the form we know. Most of the surviving panels are now in St. Petersburg. A few remain in the museum at Panjakent itself. The end of the city has a date, and the date is unusually precise because of what a shepherd found on a mountain in 1932. 722 Arab forces are moving up the Zarafshan. The ruler of Panjakent, a man named Devashtich, has been holding the city for about 16 years and has run out of options. He does not stay. He takes his household, his soldiers, and his archive, and he withdraws east to a small castle on a crag called Mount Mug. He is besieged there. He is captured in the late summer. He is executed shortly afterward. And his archive stays on the mountain. 12 centuries later, a shepherd walking above the Zarafshan finds a basket in a pit. Inside it is paper. The men who first see it think it is pages from an old Quran. It is not. It is 81 documents in Sogdian, 1 in Arabic, 1 in Turkic, and several in Chinese. The working files of a small kingdom in the last 2 years of its life. Contracts, marriage terms, letters about grain and troop movements, and who could be trusted. It is the most complete record we have of a Central Asian state disappearing. And the survivors, according to the account that has come down, did not go west into the plains where the new order was settling. They went up. Northeast of Panjakent, the Yagnob River cuts a valley between 2 ranges. The villages in it sit between 2,500 and 3,000 meters. There is no proper road. In winter, the passes close, and for months, the valley is as isolated as any inhabited place in Central Asia. The people who live there call themselves Yagnobi, and the language they speak at home is the direct descendant of Sogdian. Not a relative, a descendant. Linguists sometimes call it New Sogdian. It is the last living branch of the tongue that ran the Silk Road, preserved for 1,300 years by nothing more sophisticated than distance and snow. Until the 1980s, it had no written form at all. Everything in it, every word, was carried in people's mouths. They also kept fragments of what came before Islam. Fire respected in the home, fire jumped over at the new year. A quiet, Zoroastrian residue folded into ordinary Muslim life, the way a foundation stays under a house that has been rebuilt. And in 1970, the Soviet state emptied the valley. The stated reason was danger. The Yagnob was called a geodynamic hazard zone, prone to earthquake and landslide, and the population had to be moved for its own protection. Red Army helicopters came over the passes. Around 3,000 people were lifted out, village by village, and set down in Zafarabad, a cotton-growing lowland near the Uzbek border. Their houses in the valley were pulled down behind them so they could not come back. The lowland was hot in a way that mountain people had no defense against. There was malaria, there were deaths, there was cotton and quotas, and a great deal of work in temperatures 40 degrees higher than anything they had known. Historians who have looked at the decision are fairly direct about it. The hazard argument was available. The cotton fields needed hands, and building roads and clinics into the Yagnob would have cost more than moving everybody out. In the 1990s, some were allowed to return. Only a few hundred did. The houses were gone, the terraces had collapsed, and there was nothing in the valley to earn a living from. Today, the largest group of Yagnobi speakers does not live in the Yagnob. It lives in Zafarabad. The language that outlasted the Arab conquest, the Mongols, the Emirates, and the Russian Empire is now most often spoken on a cotton plain by people whose grandparents were carried there in a helicopter. Downstream, the Zarafshan runs west, past a site older than any of it, Sarazm, 5,500 years old, where metalworkers were smelting copper and trading turquoise and lapis before the pyramids were finished. It is the oldest evidence anyone has of urban life in this region. The pattern was set very early here. Things get made in the mountains, they get sold a long way away. North of the mountains, past the tunnel under the Anzob Pass, the country changes character entirely. This is Sugd, lower, warmer, greener, and more crowded, the southern lip of the Fergana Valley and the industrial half of Tajikistan. Its capital is Khujand, and Khujand is old. It was founded by Alexander of Macedon around 329 before the Common Era, and named Alexandria Eshkate, Alexandria the furthest. The last city he built at the northeastern limit of his march, still here on the Sir Daria, with a fortress and a bazaar and 250,000 people. Nearby, in Istaravshan, metalworkers still make knives by hand in a covered market, hammering blades in the lanes their grandfathers worked. Under the Soviet Union, Sugd was where the plan put the factories. Cotton processing, textiles, silk, a uranium industry at Chekhalovsk that fed the Soviet nuclear program. Whole towns were built around single enterprises with apartment blocks, clinics, kindergartens, and a guaranteed wage attached. That system did not wind down slowly. In 1991, it stopped. The transfers from Moscow ended. The supply chains that fed the factories ran through republics that were now foreign countries. The buyers vanished. Within 5 years of independence, Tajikistan's economy had contracted by roughly 60%. Not a recession, a collapse of most of the machine. The men who had run lathes in Kujand, picked cotton in Katlon, taught school in the Rasht Valley, all faced the same arithmetic at once. There was no work. There was still a family. And there was a country to the north that spoke a language they already knew, that needed labor, and that did not require a visa. That is where the story of the money starts. Not with a policy, with an empty factory and a train ticket. Higher up, in the thin air of the Pamir, there is something that survives on almost nothing at all: the Apollo butterflies. Several species of them live in these mountains, and one, the regal Apollo, is among the rarest butterflies on Earth, found in a narrow band of high valleys in Tajikistan and northern Afghanistan, and almost nowhere else. They breed above 3,000 meters. At that altitude, the flying season is not a season. It is a window, a matter of weeks, between the last hard frost of spring and the first of autumn, and everything the insect does has to fit inside it. The caterpillars solve it by being slow. They can take 2 years to develop, overwintering in the ground, sometimes twice. The adults are pale and heavy-scaled, with dark spots and red eye markings, and they bask flat against warm rock to lift their body temperature high enough to fly at all. Everything about them is an adaptation to shortage, short summers, thin air, a world with very little to offer, worked out to the last available week. The same mountains that starve a butterfly of warmth give the country its one enormous asset: water. Tajikistan holds something on the order of 60% of Central Asia's water. Every glacier in the Pamir is a battery. Every river coming off them is potential electricity, and the Soviet Union noticed. Between 1961 and 1980, they built Nurek. It is an earth-filled dam on the Vaksh, 304 meters high. When it was completed, it was the tallest dam in the world, and it is still the tallest of its type. A wall of rock and clay taller than the Eiffel Tower, holding back a reservoir 70 kilometers long, generating about 3/4 of the country's electricity. It sits in one of the most seismically active regions on the continent, and it is built to move. The central core is a wedge of impermeable clay, and the rock shells on either side are designed to settle and shift under an earthquake rather than crack. Half a century on, it is being refitted turbine by turbine, each unit lifted from 335 megawatts to 375. And with all of that, with 60% of the region's water and the tallest earth-filled dam on the planet, this country still turns the lights off in winter. The rivers are fed by snow and ice. In January, there is no melt. Flow drops, and generation drops with it, exactly when demand peaks and the temperature falls below freezing. For years, households outside the capital have lived with scheduled power, a few hours in the morning and a few at night, from October to April. A country that could power its neighbors cannot reliably heat its own villages in February. There is a reason people here talk about Nurek in the past tense, and about a different dam in the future tense. But that one is further upstream, and it needs the rest of the country explained first. East of Nurek, the road that runs to the roof of the world begins. The Pamir Highway is a Soviet military road, numbered M41, running from Dushanbe through the western Pamir to Korog and out across the eastern plateau to the Kyrgyz border. It is the second highest international highway on Earth after the Karakoram, and it crosses the Akbaital Pass at 4,655 meters. For its western half, it follows a river. On one bank, there is Tajikistan. On the other, close enough to see washing hung out to dry, there is Afghanistan. This is Gorno-Badakhshan. It is an autonomous region that covers about 45% of the country's territory and holds around 3% of its people. It is the emptiest place in Tajikistan, and culturally, it is the least like the rest of it. The people here are Pamiris. They speak Shugni, Waki, Rushani, Bartangi, Ishkashimi, a family of Eastern Iranian languages related to each other and not really mutually intelligible with Tajik. And most of them are Ismaili Muslims, which in Central Asia makes them a minority inside a minority. That is the work of one man, and he arrived 1,000 years ago. His name was Nasir Khusra, a Persian poet and philosopher who converted to Ismailism in Cairo in the 11th century, was driven out of Khorasan for it, and spent the last decades of his life in exile in these mountains. He wrote, he taught, he sent missionaries up the side valleys, and the faith he carried into Badakhshan took hold so completely that 1,000 years later, Pamiri households still recite his poetry, and the name of a man who died around 1088 is spoken in the same room as the name of the living Imam. You can see the whole of that inheritance in the shape of a house. The traditional Pamiri house is called a chid. From outside, it is unremarkable, a low, flat-roofed structure of stone and timber. Inside, it is a diagram of the universe. There is one main room held up by 5 wooden pillars. Each has a name and stands for a figure of the family of the Prophet: Muhammad, Ali, Fatima, Hassan, Hussein. The first is traditionally cut from juniper, the sacred wood, whose smoke cleans a room. There are no longer enough junipers of that size in the Pamir, so new houses use what they can get. The floor is built in 3 levels. The lowest is bare earth for the mineral world. A raised platform above it is for the vegetable soul. The highest level, where the family sleeps and eats, is for the thinking soul. And in the ceiling, there is a skylight called a chorkona, 4 wooden squares set inside one another and turned 45 degrees, stepping upward toward a small opening. The 4 layers are earth, water, air, and fire, with fire nearest the sky, because fire is what the sunlight touches first in the morning. It is Zoroastrian architecture wearing Islamic names. The symbolism was already ancient when Nasir Khusra arrived to reinterpret it, and the reinterpretation is now itself 1,000 years old. None of this is in a museum. People live in these rooms. The stove is lit, the tea is poured, the smoke goes up through the fire square, and a family that will host any traveler who arrives at dusk sleeps on the platform for the thinking soul. It is worth saying clearly what that means, because the standard description of this region gets it backward. Gorno-Badakhshan is usually introduced by its numbers. Poorest region of the poorest country in the former Soviet Union. Highest rate of labor migration, lowest population density, permits required to enter. Every one of those figures is accurate, and none of them describe the place. What is here is one of the most educated rural populations in Central Asia, in a region where literacy stayed near universal through a decade in which the state effectively ceased to function. where a household with no cash income will still put a stranger by the fire and refuse payment, and where so many young people leave not because they have nothing, but because they have qualifications the valley cannot use. Korog, the regional capital, sits at 2,200 meters in a gorge so narrow the town is essentially one long street. Above it, there is a botanical garden at over 2,300 meters, the highest in the former Soviet Union, where they have spent decades proving that plants from other continents can be persuaded to grow here. That is the local instinct in one sentence. Grow the thing that is not supposed to survive at an altitude where it should not be possible, and then give the fruit to a visitor. East of Korog, the mountains stop pretending to be mountains and become something else. The eastern Pamir is not a range of peaks. It is a plateau, a high, cold desert averaging around 4,000 meters, where the valley floors are already higher than most of the Alps, and the mountains rise only another 1,000 meters above them. It looks less like Central Asia than like Tibet, which is not a coincidence because it is built by the same collision.
There is almost no rain.
12 centimeters a year in places. The ground is gravel and saltpan and thin yellow grass, and the light at that altitude does something to distance that photographs never quite capture. Karakul lies in the north of it, a salt lake 25 kilometers across at nearly 4,000 meters, sitting inside a meteorite impact crater roughly 25 million years old. In winter, it freezes solid. Bulunkul, further south, records the coldest temperatures in the country, down past minus 60 degrees. People live there anyway, in low houses beside the water, herding yaks. The population out here is mostly not Tajik, it is Kyrgyz, and it has been for centuries, running livestock across a plateau that cannot support crops. And on the ridges above them, the animal everyone comes here hoping to see is almost certainly watching and will not be seen. The snow leopard. There are, by most estimates, a few hundred in Tajikistan. They hold territories that can run to hundreds of square kilometers because at this altitude, prey is scattered so thinly that a smaller range would starve them. Everything about the animal is a solution to cold and altitude. The tail is nearly as long as the body, a counterweight on rock, wrapped over the face when it sleeps. The chest cavity is enlarged for thin air. The paws are broad and furred underneath, snowshoes with claws in them. And unlike every other big cat, it cannot roar. The throat structure that produces a roar is simply not there. It hunts ibex and Marco Polo sheep, and it can take an animal 3 times its own weight on ground where a slip is fatal. It has been illegal to hunt one here since 1968. That did not stop the decline because the pressure was never really trophy hunting. It was arithmetic in a herder's head. When wild prey thins out, a snow leopard takes livestock. When a snow leopard takes livestock, a family that owns 20 animals is down a month of income. And so it gets killed, and the skin and the bones get sold because there is a market for both. What has changed it, where it has changed, is the same uncomfortable machinery that saved the Marco Polo sheep. Community conservancies, predator-proof corrals at night, and rangers drawn from the villages that used to do the shooting. Camera trap density is up in the conservancies at Alichur and in Darvoz. It is not sentiment that is protecting this animal. It is a functioning local economy, which is, in the end, the thing this whole country is short of. There is a lake in the middle of the Pamir that should not exist, and everyone who lives below it knows exactly what it is. February the 18th, 1911. It is night in the Batang Valley. An earthquake of magnitude 7.4 strikes the central Pamir, and 2.5 kilometers of mountainside comes off the slope above the village of Usoy. Around 2 cubic kilometers of rock lands in the gorge. The village is directly beneath it. Everyone in Usoy dies that night, and accounts of how many that was vary from a few dozen to several hundred, because the record keeping in that valley in that year was not equal to what happened to it. 3 men from Usoy are alive at dawn, only because they had walked to the next village and stayed the night. They come back over the pass in the morning, and there is a wall of dust standing where their home used to be, and under it there is no home, no houses, no bodies, nothing to dig for. What the landslide has done, besides burying a village, is block the Murghab River completely. The water begins to rise behind it at an average of about 75 meters a year. Within 2 years, there is a lake. Within 4, it is 60 kilometers long, 500 meters deep, and holding something close to 17 cubic kilometers of water.
It is called Sares.
The rock wall holding it in is called the Usoy Dam, and at roughly 560 meters, it is the highest dam of any kind on Earth, natural or built. Nothing engineered comes close. And in more than a century, it has never once gone over the top. The water leaves instead through the base, filtering out through the loose rubble as a line of springs on the downstream face that regroup and become the river again. The lake has found its own equilibrium. The surface rises about 18 centimeters a year, and there are still 50 meters of freeboard between the water and the lowest point of the wall. The question that has occupied engineers since the Soviet period is what happens if another slope fails into the lake and a wave goes over that wall. Below Sares, there are villages, and below them, the valley opens toward the Panj, and beyond that, there are towns in 3 countries. Locals call it the Sleeping Dragon. There is a monitoring station on the shore and an early warning system down the valley, and people plant apricot trees under a lake held back by a hill made of rubble. That is the underlying condition of life here, and it has nothing to do with fatalism. It is the arrangement being clear-eyed about the size of the things above you that you did not put there and cannot move. South of the mountains, the land finally lets go, and Tajikistan becomes flat. This is Katlon. It is the country's most populous province, its agricultural engine, and the source of more of its migrant workers than anywhere else. The Vaksh and the Panj meet here to form the Amu Darya, the river the Greeks called the Oxus. The valley floor is fertile and hot, and under the Soviet plan, it was turned into cotton. Enormous irrigation schemes, canals cut across the whole valley, entire settlements built to house a workforce moved down from the mountains to pick it. Cotton is demanding. It wants water in a region that will spend the next century arguing about water, and it wants labor in bulk at harvest. For decades, it got both, including school children pulled out of classrooms to meet quotas. The system rewarded nobody who worked in it. Farmers ran up debts against next season's crop that they could not clear. When the Soviet market for Tajik cotton evaporated, the debts did not, which is why Katlon empties every spring. Kulob, in the east of the province, has sent generations of men north. So has Vos. So has Farkor. In parts of this valley, A household without at least one member abroad is the unusual case. There is one corner of Katlan that was never ploughed. Tigravaya Balka. It is a reserve at the confluence of the Vaksh and the Panj, and it protects the largest surviving stand of Tugai forest in Central Asia. Dense, riverine woodland of poplar, willow, tamarisk, and reed, the ecosystem that once lined every major river in this region and has been almost entirely cleared everywhere else. The name means Tiger Gully. It is named for the Caspian tiger, one of the largest tigers that has ever existed. It hunted this forest and the Amu Darya and the reed beds of the Aral Basin. As the Tugai was cut for farmland and the deer and boar were shot out from under it, the tiger had nothing left to hunt and nowhere left to hide. The last confirmed record in Tajikistan is from 1958. The reserve keeps the name of an animal it no longer contains. What it does still contain is the deer the tiger used to hunt. The Bukhara deer is a subspecies of red deer, adapted to riverine forest rather than mountain or steppe. Smaller and paler than its European relatives, built to move through reed and thicket, feeding on the Tugai's leaves and shoots. By the 1960s, there were only a few hundred left in all of Central Asia. They are still here. The population inside Tigravaya Balka has recovered into the thousands across the region, through nothing more complicated than a protected forest, a permanent ranger presence, and a hunting ban that was actually enforced. It is a narrow kind of victory, and worth being honest about. The predator is not coming back. What has been saved is one species in one forest in the gully named after the thing that ate it. The hardest years in this country's modern history began in 1992, and they began over the question of who would run a state that had just been left holding itself. Independence arrived in September 1991, largely unrequested. Within months, the country divided along lines that were regional as much as political. Kulob and Kujand on one side, Gam and Badakhshan on the other, with the old party structure, regional patronage networks, and an Islamic opposition all contending for what was left. The civil war ran for 5 years. Estimates of the dead run from 40,000 to well over 100,000. More than 1 million people were displaced inside the country or across the border into Afghanistan. Villages were destroyed. Whole professions left and did not return. There were massacres. There were columns of refugees on winter roads. There was a year in which the state, for practical purposes, did not exist across much of its own territory. The peace agreement was signed in 1997 in Moscow, and it held. That is not a small thing, and it is genuinely unusual for a conflict of that type. But the country it produced was one where the economy was gone, the infrastructure was broken, and roughly a fifth of the working population was already outside its borders. The men who left in 1993 did not leave to build a remittance economy. They left because there was fighting at home and work in Russia, and they sent money back because their families had nothing. The fighting ended. The sending did not. Upstream of Nurek, on the same river, there is a construction site that the country has been paying for out of its own pocket for a decade. Ragun. It was begun in 1976 and abandoned when the Soviet Union came apart. In 1993, a flood destroyed what had been built. For 20 years, it existed mainly as an argument. Construction restarted in 2016. The design calls for a rock-filled dam with a clay core, 335 meters high, which when it tops out, will be the tallest dam in the world. 6 turbines, 3,600 megawatts, roughly doubling the country's generating capacity. The first 2 units are already turning. The way this project is usually reported outside the region is as a water dispute. Upstream country builds enormous dam. Downstream country worries about irrigation. Tension follows. That framing was accurate for about 15 years and has been out of date for most of a decade. Relations with Uzbekistan changed after 2016, and the downstream objection has largely turned into a purchase agreement. The story the outside coverage keeps telling is one the countries involved have mostly finished having. What Rogun actually is, from inside Tajikistan, is a bet on ending the winter. A reservoir of that size is not primarily a generator, it is storage. Enough water held back through the summer melt to release through January and February, which is the exact problem Nurek cannot solve. That is what it is for, not export first, lights first. It has been funded partly by international lenders and partly by the population. There were public share offerings. There was pressure on state employees to buy in. And it is being financed, in the end, out of an economy that is itself financed from abroad. Which brings this back to where it started, the money. Where it comes from, what it does, and what it costs. Go up into the Fan Mountains, north of Dushanbe, and find a village at around 2,000 meters. There are hundreds like it. One of them is called Kante. About 1,500 people live in it, on slopes above a valley, with terraced fields and a collective tobacco farm that stopped working when the Soviet Union did. Walk in on an ordinary weekday in May and count who is there. Children, women, men over 60, boys under 16. Almost every male between 18 and 55 is in Russia. This is not an anomaly. At the peak, something over 1 million people have been abroad at once, out of a population of 10.5 million. Roughly 44% of households have had at least one member working outside the country. 90% of them are men. Around 98% of them go to Russia. In some mountain districts, migration is not an event in a life. It is a stage of one. A young man finishes school. He goes. He comes back to marry. He goes again. He returns when his own son is old enough to go instead. And the money is enormous. In 2024, $5.8 billion came home. That was an increase of 27% over the previous year, in the middle of a period when everything about working in Russia was getting harder, not easier. It does not arrive as investment. It arrives as ordinary life, in amounts of $200 and $400 through transfer counters in every district center. It goes on food, school clothes, medical bills, a roof, a wedding, a second floor that will be finished next year if the work holds. That is what has driven the numbers economists find striking about this country. Growth above 8%. Poverty at the international line falling from around 55% in 2010 to under 15% now. Real, measurable, in living memory. And it is bought at a price that is paid entirely by the people who stay. Start with what a village looks like when its men are gone for 10 months of the year. The women run everything. The land, the livestock, the budget, the school run, the funerals, the negotiations with in-laws, who in this society still hold considerable authority over a wife in her husband's absence. It is a full second job layered onto the first, and it does not come with the authority to make decisions. Then there is what happens when the money stops. Some men lose work and cannot admit it. Some are deported over a paperwork violation and banned from re-entry for years and do not tell anyone at home. Some start a second family in Russia. Some simply stop writing. An OSCE study found that close to a quarter of the women left behind did not know where their husbands were and were receiving nothing at all. Those households have no legal claim, no income, no way to remarry, and no way to travel north to find out. They stay in the village, on land that is not theirs, dependent on a family that has its own problems, waiting on a transfer that is not coming. Which is the point at which this documentary has to go back to a bag of letters in the Gobi desert. Mivne had followed her husband east because that is what the arrangement required. He earned in another country. She waited. The system worked as long as he kept writing, and when he stopped, every mechanism she had was social. Ask this relative, petition that counselor, wait for permission from a man who is not there to give it. She could not travel without consent. She could not earn. She could not go home. She ended up dependent on the charity of a priest in a foreign city, writing letters that she had no way of knowing would never be delivered. 1,700 years later, in a mountain village between the Zarafshan and the Fan, a woman is checking a transfer counter in the district center for the 4th week running, and there is nothing under her name. The technology has changed completely, paper to fiber optic, camel to airliner. The distance is shorter and the money moves in seconds. Everything else is identical. And that is what the number in the headline actually means. When you read that half of this country's economy is earned abroad, it sounds like a statistic about weakness. It is not. It is a statistic about an arrangement that this region invented, that made it wealthy once, that its people are extraordinarily good at, and that has always transferred the risk from the person earning to the person waiting. The Sogdians ran that arrangement for 600 years and got rich. Their descendants are running it now and are getting by. The difference is not competence. It is that the Sogdians owned the road. Their descendants are working on somebody else's. And that is why the shape of the next 10 years is unknown. The rules in Russia have been tightening, quotas by sector, faster deportations, registries that cap how much money a listed worker may move in a month, which is another way of saying a restriction on sending anything home at all. The number of Tajik workers going north has started to slip, while the amount they send has gone up. And that is a pattern that cannot continue in both directions forever. Some are trying other destinations: Kazakhstan, the Gulf, South Korea. None absorb people at the scale Russia does. Meanwhile, Rogan climbs toward its final height, and the government talks about factories, processing, tourism, and an economy that keeps its own people. Nobody can tell you yet whether that arrives before the transfers stop. High in the eastern Pamir, on a slope near Karakul, there is an animal that has already solved the problem this country is facing, in the only way it can be solved. The long-tailed marmot spends about 8 months of the year underground. It cannot store food because there is nothing at that altitude worth storing, so it stores the food inside itself. Through a summer of 10 or 11 weeks, it eats almost continuously, turning a thin alpine meadow into body fat. Then it seals itself into a burrow with its family and lets its own body temperature fall to a few degrees above freezing. Its heartbeat drops to a handful of beats a minute. It waits out 240 days of a winter it has no other answer to. And in spring, it comes up, on the same slope, at the mouth of the same burrow its family has used for generations. It does not migrate. It cannot. Everything it needs to survive the year has to be gathered in the short season it has, in the place it already is. There is a version of this story that ends in reassurance, and it would not be honest. Tajikistan is not a country that failed and is being propped up. It is a mountain nation with 60% of Central Asia's water, 5,500 years of continuous settlement, a merchant history that ran the Silk Road, and a habit of sending its earners over the horizon that is at least 17 centuries old. What it does not have is a way for a young man in Kante to earn a living within sight of his own house. Everything else follows from that. The empty photographs, the half-finished second floors, the women running villages alone, the $5.8 billion, the dam being paid for by people working 2,000 miles away from it. The letters in the Gobi were never delivered. Nobody in Panjakent ever learned what happened to Munay, and nobody has learned since. That silence is 1,700 years old, and there are households in these mountains living inside the same silence right now, this week, waiting on a name that does not appear on a screen at a transfer counter. The mountains will hold. The lake behind the rubble wall will keep finding its level, one spring line at a time. The marmots will go down in September and come up in May, for as long as there is grass on that slope. Whether the people who live between them will still have to leave to stay is a question this country has not been given the chance to answer for itself. Thank you for watching. Until the next journey.